Welcome to lesson 58, finding the greatest common factor of monomials. We're going to figure out how to identify the greatest common factor of terms and how to organize those factors for each monomial, identifying the greatest common factor that is a number as well as a variable. Here's our first example, finding the greatest common factor of 6x squared and 9x cubed. I'm actually going to show you two different ways that can work for this. I'm going to split it in half. One using just rainbow factor pairs, and the other one using prime factorization. Both will work, whichever one is your preference is the one you can use. So I'll start with the factor pairs first. I'm going to take the monomial 6x squared and I'm going to split it into 6 times x squared. And 6, I'm going to just list some factor pairs. 1 times 6 and 2 times 3. And x squared is just x times x. And I'm going to do the same thing to 9x to the third power. I'm going to separate these and list the factor pairs for 9. 1 times 9 and 3 times 3. And for x cubed, x times x times x. Now, this is where you can now list all your factors, almost like a factor rainbow. Just list them out. So here's 6x squared. 1, 2, 3, 6. And x times x. And for 9x cubed, the factors are 1, 3, 9, and x times x times x. And usually you just look to see what the greatest common factor is on the list. So for just looking at the numbers, the greatest number they have in common is 3. So that would be their greatest common factor. And then with the x's, since they have 2 in common, we would say x squared. And that would be the greatest common factor, 3x squared. So that's one way you can hit pause so you can jot this down. Now here's another way that I've seen a lot of students use, where they find the prime factors of 6 and 9. And they just start listing factor pairs. So for example, 2 times 3 makes 6. And they're prime, so they can just stop there. And for 9, the only factor pairs would be 3 times 3. So you would stop there. And so they would list those factors out as well. And notice it's a multiplication sentence, because these are prime factors that create the number. And again, you look to see what do they have in common. And they both have a 3 in common. So the greatest common factor for these two numbers is 3. And the same thing for these two, you can look to see, well, what would they have in common? They would both have x squared in common. And a lot of kids end up just doing the mental math where they know they can just see it's the same x, so they're going to have these two in common. So either way will work. If you would rather list the factor pairs or do it with mental math, sometimes and by this level in algebra, you could just look at two numbers and just know what the greatest common factor is. Whichever one works for you, but you want to make sure you're fully factorizing numbers and get the greatest common factor possible. So whichever method works for you. So hit pause and jot this down into your notes. We're going to give you some practice. Here are 2 to work on. The first one is 9g to the third power and 27g to the fifth. Find the greatest common factor, as well as 10ab and 11bc. So hit pause and use whatever method you like to find the greatest common factor. Remember, you have to find the greatest common factor in terms of numbers and variables. Hit pause. All right, let's do the reveal. And for the first one, the greatest common factor is 9g to the third power. And for the second one, the greatest common factor is B. So go back and check your work and see if you have have those same answers for a GCF. All right, if you have something different, we'll go over them together if you just want to see how we work it out. Again, it doesn't matter which method you'd like to use. I'm going to start with 9g to the third, 27g to the fifth. So for 9 and 27, I'm just listing factors out first. So 9, 1, and 3 times 3. And for 27, 27 times 1, and 9 times 3. So just looking at the list, what do they have in common? Their greatest number they have in common is that 9. So I'm going to list that as part of the greatest common factor. And then just looking at the g's, the variables, g times g times g, and this one has 5 g's. So I know that they're going to have 3 g's in common, or g to the third. All right, let's look at the second one. 10ab, there are actually 3 in here. Is 10 times a times b. And 10, I can find the factors, 10 times 1 and 5 times 2. And 11 BC is 11 times B times C, and 11 only has the factors 11 and 1. So now I'm just looking again for what they have in common, and the only thing they have in common is a 1. So that is their greatest common factor numerically. And in terms of variables, just a B. So their greatest common factor is 1b, or as I wrote it, just b. All right, that's it for today's lesson. Remember, the big key for this one is to identify the greatest common factor of both, of the entire monomial, of the number as well as any variables, and it has to be the greatest common one so we can fully factorize numbers in the next lesson. That's it for today. I'll see you in the next one. Be well.